Hey learners, so I am in this video going to unpack the clinical implications paper. Now, first off, I designed this paper because I really wanted to equip those of you who might have some interest in clinical work, which is a pretty broad term to encompass anything related to therapy, so psychotherapy or so if you're interested in being a marriage and family therapist or a social worker or a psychologist or maybe one of our programs like the uh, licensed professional clinical counselor or the uh, 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 child life specialist. So if you're interested in anything where you're applying psychology to help people, that's clinical work. And I thought this is a project, an assignment that can help you think about how to do that. Because, I mean, this class does offer a lot of insights and perspectives and theories that can help you in your clinical work. So, so for the paper, I'm asking you to address one of 6 disorders. And the 6 include, and I'm using some casual terms here, but let me make it real specific. So you can address major depression, specific phobia, substance. I have it here, substance addiction, but in the DSM-5, it's called substance use disorder, ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, and autism spectrum disorder. So those are your 6 options, and you can choose whatever you have an interest in or have a, some familiarity with. And so I encourage you to pick the one that you'll enjoy writing about the most. And then the purpose of the assignment really is to bring back to the forefront some psychological explanations for mental illness. I think our society has really become inundated with neurobiology. So we think about, you can watch commercials on television that talk about medications for treating mental disorders. And so the result is we often think about mental disorders as brain diseases. Now, that's obviously true, obviously good, but there's a downside, which is that we think about things biologically, but we don't really appreciate that there's also psychological explanations, right? So potentially we can say, well, there's an interlocking between the biology and the psychology. Now, the neurobiology offers snazzy images of the brain that look impressive, but as students in psychology, it's important to know and understand biology. And I'm not taking away from that at all, but it's also important to explain problems in psychological language and to explain how does the environment affect a person's behavior? How does a person's cognitive schemas affect their behavior? How does a person's social nature affect their behavior? And how are memory and motivation involved? And so that's what I want you to do in this paper, is really work to explain these disorders from a psychological lens. So this class offers 5 levels of analysis. Levels of analysis is maybe not the right term, but it offers 5 broad theories of about human behavior. And the first is the behaviorist perspective, or behaviorism, which is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I want you, if it's at all possible, to bring those into the understanding of the disorder. Then we've also covered cognitive perspectives. So these included the early cognitive theories, and then we had Bruner and Piaget and Vygotsky. And then towards the later part of the class, we're focusing on memory. So we're talking about short-term memory. We're talking about sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and we're we're saying that part of problems in functioning can be about deficits in our memory. Then we're going to talk about motivation, and finally, social learning perspectives. And those last two are towards the end of the class. So, so if you're trying to incorporate that, you might not understand those perspectives quite there yet when you're watching this video and trying to understand what this assignment is all about. But those are chapters that are going to be addressed towards the end of the class. And so this paper is due at the end of the class because I want you to be able to incorporate some of those into it. And what I do want to make clear is it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it may be possible to weave all 5 of those into your paper on a diagnosis, but the reality is some of those perspectives might not apply as much as others. All right, so the paper itself has 4 sections. The first one, I really just want you to lay out what is the diagnosis that you've chosen, how is it diagnosed? So in particular, how does DSM-5 diagnose it? And I don't want you to quote extensively from it. I do want you to walk through the symptoms. And so I want you to, well, it's actually a balance depending on the disorder you're talking about. Some disorders will have like 15 or 20 symptoms that can be incorporated. I don't want to know all 15 of them. But if there's a disorder that you chose and it has a smaller set of symptoms, 3, 4, 5, 6 symptoms, I encourage you to tell us all of them. And then if it's on the higher end, what I would encourage is give a few example symptoms. And again, help us understand how do you diagnose this disorder, and really work at, again, I encourage you to look at the DSM-5, and I'm going to include a link so you can actually access the DSM-5 and use that to try to communicate how it's diagnosed. But that's one half of that first section. The second half is epidemiology. Epidemiology is a fancy term for the spread of disease. So what I want you to do is tell me, how is this disease spread throughout the population? And if you want, you could just use the American population. So what is the overall percentage of people that have this disorder? And then tell us about any imbalances. Talk about gender. Do males have this more than females, or do females have it more than males? Talk about ethnic differences. If you have that data accessible, what are the differences in Caucasian, African American, Asian American, different ethnic groups? Again, if that is available to you, present it to us. Talk about differences at different ages, right? So is there a different prevalence rate for the youth or young adults or old or middle-aged adults or older adults? Is there any differences there? And give us a picture of that. And let's see here. Anything else that you feel is interesting about the epidemiology would be great. Okay, so that's the first section. It helps us familiarize ourselves with the disorder. The second section, but this is really the most important section, is where you talk about the learning and memory systems. So you talk about how classical conditioning fits into this disorder, how operant conditioning, how cognitive schemas, how motivational processes or social learning or memory systems, how does it relate to this disorder? And again, the textbook offers some of that, but I encourage you to do PsycInfo searches, Google Scholar searches, look pretty broadly. use like the search terms of the major key terms that we've discussed in this class, like classical conditioning, operant conditioning, working memory, long-term memory, things like that, and see if that relates to the disorder. And what you'll probably be surprised is there is actually a lot of overlap in this. And what I've tried to do, and later on in this PowerPoint, which I have made available to you, but I will not actually unpack in full, I give you some ideas to investigate. And I'm not saying that those are exhaustive. I'm just saying those are probably good starting points for your research. Okay, so that should be 1.5 to 2.5 pages of your paper. The third section, I think this is the funnest part of about the behavior. I want you to make up a case. So it's called a clinical vignette, a made-up case study. Now, you may have a person in mind that you're using for the study. Keep their confidentiality. Don't tell us who it is. In fact, try to mask it a little bit by changing some of the basic details like their age or a little bit of their background. But tell us the pertinent information about that person. Don't get lost in details. Don't tell long stories about what they've experienced or their background. Keep it to the point. Tell us why they are coming for treatment or coming for evaluation. What's their presenting problem? That's a term that gets used to as it means what led them in their mind to come for evaluation or treatment, to seek out professional help. Talk about their symptoms. Say from your perspective, what symptoms are they observing? And some of the symptoms might overlap with their presenting problem. That's okay. Then talk about again, unpack what are some ideas of the applications of learning theory to their situation. Keep this pretty brief, right? Talk about like if it's an Alzheimer's disease patient, talk about how their episodic memory has been fading and is not as clear. Talk about their semantic memory and how that might still be intact. Don't get into a ton of detail because you already have covered that in learning and memory systems, but touch on it a little bit and then talk about what treatment would look like. So how would you help that person? And include psychological treatment and include medication. So talk about medication options alongside some psychological treatment options. And so for most of those, you're going to be talking about psychotherapy. So for depression, substance use disorder, phobia, and ADHD, you could talk about some psychotherapy approaches that might be helpful. For Alzheimer's disease and autism, psychotherapy is not necessarily as effective, but you could still talk about some interventions that might be helpful. For autism, you could talk about applied behavioral analysis. It's, again, not a type of psychotherapy, but it's a type of intervention that can help them. And Alzheimer's is perhaps the one that we have the least evidence base for psychosocial interventions. So you could talk about doing some cognitive training with them, or talk about potential applications that might be helpful. But you'll also want to focus in on the medications and unpack what those could look like. And for all the disorders, you want to talk about medications. So again, in this clinical vignette, talk about presenting problem, symptoms, the basics of their observed, the learning and memory systems that are involved. Again, talk about them having triggers that have been classically conditioned, or talk about some basics reinforcers. Don't go into a ton of detail. Talk about the treatment options, and that can wrap up the clinical vignette. And then just add in a final conclusion, wrapping it all up, and that's it. So the paper will be about 5 to 7 pages. You should have a title page and a reference page, and those are separate from, those are not included in the 5 pages. And so again, you do want to provide some depth here, and this should be at least a page. This should be probably 2 pages, maybe 2.5. This should be about 1.5 pages, or more, I guess, for all of these. And then conclusion could be 1/2 page, maybe 3/4 of a page. And yeah, here's some examples for case vignettes. This is not final or complete, but here you have Harold is a 12-year-old Caucasian male who lives with his parents and is in the 7th grade. He presented, this is presenting problem, with failing to turn in school assignments, frequent classroom disruptions, and difficulty concentrating. Again, these are related to symptoms, but it's like, why are they bringing Harold in for treatment? He had symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. He was diagnosed with ADHD. Treatment is Ritalin and behavioral therapy. Outcome, and this is the final thing I want you to include in the case vignette. So I guess it's the 5th thing, is how does treatment, what's the outcome of treatment? And so ADHD, you can see significant improvements in academic performance, behavior, and attention with treatment. And so Alzheimer's, just be aware, the outcome tends to be that there's ongoing progressive deterioration. So that should probably be the ultimate outcome. And so make it real. Make it authentic. Don't make it some miraculous case. Make it represent what you can actually see. One more case vignette. Pablo is an 84-year-old Hispanic male who is widowed and lives with his oldest daughter. He presented with memory problems, occasionally getting lost and difficulty following conversations. He had impaired verbal memory, visuospatial functioning, executive functioning, and had symptoms of depression. He was diagnosed with probable Alzheimer's disease following a neuropsychological battery. All right, so again, you can, these are very to the point. You can add in more details, more information, help the case come alive a little bit. But again, I'm showing you the key things that you would want to include in it. And a few more things to note. Quotes in psychology, you want to use quotes sparingly. In fact, if you have no quotes at all, and I mean those things that are directly taken from another source, if you have none of them, that's great. If you have 1 or 2, that's fine. But if you have multiple, or if you have very long ones, I really encourage you to paraphrase instead. Don't quote. You may find it hard to paraphrase particular wording. Do your best. Try to, I have a rule of thumb that every 3rd word should be different. Again, that's not precise, and you'll, but that at least shows that you're trying to process the quote and turn it into your own words. So I say quote only when the particular wording is important. And if you do quote, remember to cite the page number from the source that you quoted from. That's APA style. I do encourage you to use subheadings. So subheadings are bold. So you start off diagnosis and epidemiology, and then you have the paragraph after that. Then you have the next bold heading, the learning and memory systems, and then you have the text below that. So don't worry too much about making smooth transitions between sections. Just use the subheadings to divide up the paper. And really, I do want these subheadings in your paper. I really, it makes it so much easier to follow along. Make sure you spend adequate time on the learning and memory section. That's why you're writing this paper, and proofread your work before you turn it in. Okay, and I think that's it. Let me just look at the next one. Yeah, so the rest of this PowerPoint has some starting point information for you to think about. Again, I encourage you to collaborate with each other in the forum and share resources as you you know share the sources, the articles, the websites that you found that are helpful. But again, um, try to share those resources, but again, this is an individual paper, so make it your own. All right, and I think we're going to wrap there. So hopefully this was helpful, and good luck. Reach out if you have more questions. Okay.